I was the second kind. And by the time I was 20, I'd turned that into the only weapon I had. My name is Nora Bennett. 3 weeks before my 21st birthday, my stepmother sat across from me at the dining table she'd bought with money that used to be my father's, slid a stack of papers toward me, and said, "It's just a formality, sweetheart. You'll barely notice the difference." I smiled at her. I signed nothing. She had no idea I'd already spoken to a lawyer that morning. She had no idea, in fact, just how long I'd been watching her. And she definitely didn't know that the version of me sitting at that table wasn't the same daughter she'd spent 14 years training to be quiet. If you're new here, this channel is calm revenge stories, family stories. People who stop being quiet at exactly the right moment. Hit subscribe, drop the state you're watching from in the comments. I read every single one. Stay with me on this one, because there are 3 turns in this story most people never see coming. 1 in a storage unit 2 hours from that house, 1 in a bank 3 states away, and 1 in a courtroom, and none of them are the twist you're expecting right now. Let me take you back to the house where this really started. My father, Daniel Bennett, built a small commercial real estate firm out of a single strip mall outside Tulsa. By the time I was born, he had 11 properties and a staff of 14. He drove a Tahoe until the day he died, and never once acted like a man worth what he was worth. My mother passed when I was 4. I don't remember much of her, just the smell of her lotion and the sound of her humming while she cooked. My father remarried when I was 7. Her name was Renee. She had a son from her first marriage, Colton, 2 years older than me, and the day they moved in, Renee stood in the doorway of what used to be my father's study, now suddenly hers, and said, "We're going to be a real family now. Nora, won't that be nice?" It wasn't nice. It was a negotiation I never agreed to and never won. Renee didn't yell. She corrected. If I cried, she'd tilt her head, almost gentle, and say, "Is that really necessary?" If I laughed too loud, the air in the room would drop 10 degrees without her ever raising her voice. Colton got new cleats every season, a truck at 16. A credit card at 17 for emergencies. I got the shoes from the church donation bin, folded neatly in a bag on my bed. Like she was doing me a kindness by not throwing them straight in the trash. There was a specific afternoon I still think about. I was 9. I'd made the honor roll, and I ran into the kitchen holding the certificate, so happy I couldn't stand still. Renee looked at it for exactly 2 seconds and said, "Don't get used to people clapping for you, Nora. The real world doesn't." Then she went back to her coffee. My father wasn't home enough to see the small ways that house tilted against me. Or maybe he saw more than I realized, because of what he did later, quietly, 6 years before anyone needed it, and because of something I wouldn't find in a storage unit until I was almost 21. Something that changed how I understood every single one of those quiet years. He died when I was 16. Aortic aneurysm, at his desk, on a Tuesday, no warning. The will was read 3 weeks later in an office that smelled like old carpet and burnt coffee. Renee got day-to-day control of the firm until I turned 21. But the actual ownership, the controlling shares, the deeds to all 11 properties, sat locked in a trust in my name, untouchable until my birthday. On that day, full control transferred to me. Not Renee. Not Colton. Me. The attorney was a precise, gray-templed man named Arthur Voss, my father's college roommate. When he finished reading the trust terms, he looked directly at Renee and said, "Any attempt to transfer, encumber, or restructure firm assets prior to the vesting date triggers an automatic forensic audit and immediate removal of the acting trustee." This was Daniel's explicit instruction, and I intend to honor it exactly. Renee's smile didn't move, but something behind her eyes did, and I filed that look away without knowing yet why I needed to. There was one more thing in that reading. A small line I didn't understand at the time and almost forgot entirely. Arthur mentioned, almost as an aside, that my father had also left a sealed storage unit in Broken Arrow under a name that wasn't Bennett, to be opened only if certain conditions were met. He wouldn't say what conditions. He said my father had been specific about that, and specific men like Arthur don't argue with specific instructions. I didn't think about that storage unit again for almost 4 years. I should have. My father had left me a locked door. Renee, it turned out, had already started looking for a key long before I understood there was a lock at all. The next 4.5 years ran like clockwork on the surface. Renee managed the firm from my father's old office. Colton got everything a golden son gets. I got a scholarship to Oklahoma State and left the day after graduation, which Renee did not attend. Citing a scheduling conflict that turned out to be a spa weekend with her sister, college should have been simple. It wasn't. My tuition and housing were supposed to come from a small educational allowance my father had set up separately from the main trust, meant to release automatically each semester. Twice during sophomore year, the payment came in late, once nearly 3 weeks late, forcing me to take out a short-term loan and pick up shifts at a campus coffee shop just to cover a deposit. When I called the firm's office about it, Renee's assistant said, apologetically, Ms. Bennett's been reorganizing some of the accounts. It's just paperwork. I didn't think much of it then. I was tired, broke, and busy. I filed it away the way I filed everything else, quietly. But looking back now, I can mark that exact semester as the moment the numbers first started moving in a direction that had nothing to do with paperwork at all. It was February of my senior year, 3 months before my 21st birthday. When the first real crack showed, I came home for a long weekend and found a man in a gray suit sitting at the kitchen table with Renee. Papers spread between them, a leather folder open. Renee introduced him as a friend from the bank, just some routine paperwork. He left 30 minutes later without ever making eye contact with me. I remember the way Renee's laugh sounded when she walked him to the door, too bright, aimed at the neighbors more than at him. I almost let it go. I want to be honest about that. I stood in the hallway for a second after he left and told myself I was imagining things. That 4.5 years of a strange, cold house had made me paranoid in ways that weren't fair to Renee. Then I remembered the honor roll certificate and the shoes from the donation bin, and I stopped telling myself that. 2 weeks later, I called the firm's front office about a property tax question for a class project, commercial real estate law, and the receptionist, a woman named Pam who'd worked there since before I was born, mentioned offhand, the Route 9 building sold last month. Shame, really. Your dad loved that property. I sat very still on my dorm room bed for almost a full minute. The Route 9 building was inside the trust. It legally could not be sold without triggering the exact clause Arthur Voss had read aloud 4 years earlier. Either Pam was wrong, or something had gone very quietly, very deliberately sideways. I called Renee that night, careful, testing. Pam mentioned Route 9 sold. There was a pause just half a second too long. Then, smooth as anything, oh honey, that's an old rumor. We got an offer, considered it, decided against it. You know how Pam exaggerates. I wanted to believe her. That's the part nobody talks about in these stories. It would have been so much easier to believe her. I almost did. But 3 days later I drove past Route 9 on my way back to campus and saw a new sign bolted over the old one. A different company name. Fresh paint on the parking lot lines. I didn't call Renee back. I went quiet instead, the way that house had trained me to since I was 7 years old. And I started paying attention in a way I hadn't let myself before. That same week, something else happened that I didn't understand until much later. Pam called me back. Her voice lower than usual, almost a whisper, and said she probably shouldn't be telling me this. But a courier had come by the office twice that month asking for documents predated to before Mr. Bennett's passing, and Pam had refused to notarize anything herself, and told whoever was asking to go through Renee's own contacts instead. She said she was telling me because she'd loved my father, and because something about the whole thing had been sitting wrong in her stomach for weeks. I thanked her, hung up, and sat with that detail for a long time before I understood exactly how important it would become. But that phone call turned out to be nothing compared to what I found 3 nights later. In the one place in that house I never expected to find anything at all. I drove home the next weekend under the excuse of a dentist appointment, told Renee I'd stay 2 nights. I told Colton nothing, because Colton told Renee everything, and had since he was old enough to understand that loyalty in that house was currency you spent to stay comfortable. The first night, I waited until the house went dark and pulled every piece of mail out of the recycling bin in the garage. Bank statements addressed to Renee from an account I didn't recognize. A letter from a title company. A voided check with a signature that looked almost like my father's, except my father had been dead for 4 years and the ink was fresh. My hands went cold reading that. I photographed everything. Put it all back exactly where I found it, folded the same way. Because if that house taught me anything better than any classroom ever could, it was how to disappear inside my own silence while my eyes stayed open. I almost got caught. Around midnight, the garage door light clicked on and I heard footsteps on the concrete. I shoved the folder back into the recycling bin and grabbed a random reusable grocery bag off the shelf like I'd just come out for something mundane. It was Colton, half asleep, getting a soda from the garage fridge. He looked at me for a second too long. "You okay?" he asked. "Couldn't sleep," I said. He nodded slowly, grabbed his can, and walked back inside. I stood there another full minute before my heart stopped slamming against my ribs. What I didn't know that night, what I wouldn't learn until months later, was that Colton hadn't gone straight back to bed at all. He'd stood at the top of the stairs for almost 10 minutes, listening, trying to decide whether to tell his mother what he'd seen. I still don't fully know what made him choose not to, that first time. The next morning, I drove 40 minutes to Arthur Voss's office without calling ahead. He looked older, grayer, but his eyes were still sharp. I laid the photos on his desk and told him what Pam had said, what the sign on Route 9 looked like now, the voided check with the signature that shouldn't exist. I watched his jaw tighten in a way that men who actually love your father don't fake. "Nora," he said carefully, "do you understand what you might be showing me?" "I think Renee sold at least one property in the trust," I said. "I think there's a forged signature on a document dated after my father died. I think whatever she's doing, she's trying to finish it before my birthday." Arthur was quiet a long moment. Then he said something that raised the stakes further than I'd expected. "Renee's brother-in-law, Wade Ferris, sits on the board of a regional bank that's handled 2 of the firm's smaller loans over the years. If money moved through his contacts, unwinding it gets complicated fast. We need airtight evidence, not suspicion. And we need it before Renee realizes you're looking." That was the first time I understood this wasn't just a family betrayal. It was a clock, and somebody else besides me was also watching the seconds. He opened a drawer and pulled out a folder with my father's handwriting on the tab. "Your father gave me standing instructions 6 years ago. If credible evidence of trustee misconduct surfaced before the vesting date, I'm authorized to file for immediate emergency removal and freeze all assets pending audit. I need a sworn statement from you today, if you can manage it." I signed it in 9 minutes. My hand was shaking by the 3rd page. Before I left his office that day, I asked him, almost as an afterthought, about the storage unit he'd mentioned for years earlier at the will reading. His face changed in a way I'd never seen before, careful, almost reluctant. "Not yet," he said. "Your father was very specific about the conditions. I don't believe we're there yet. But Nora, when we are, it may explain more than the audit ever will." I left his office with that sentence sitting in my chest like a second investigation I didn't yet have permission to start. I want to pause here, because a lot of you comment on these videos asking why people don't just scream the second they find the truth. It's because quiet isn't weakness. Quiet is what you learn when loud has never once worked in your favor. I had spent 14 years learning that the only safe way to hold a feeling was to hold it silently until it became useful. The forensic audit was supposed to take 2 weeks. It ended up taking almost 8. And what it eventually uncovered was bigger and stranger than either Arthur or I expected when we started, somewhere around week 4. I hit a wall I didn't expect, and it wasn't a legal one. It was me. I'd stopped sleeping well. I was skipping meals, missing study group, snapping at my roommate over nothing. One night, close to 2 in the morning, I sat on the floor of our dorm room with every piece of evidence spread out around me like a crime scene I'd built myself. And I genuinely, quietly, considered calling Arthur in the morning to tell him to drop it. Let Renee keep the property she'd already moved. Take what was left. Just be done, be quiet, the way I'd always been. My roommate, Priya, found me there. She didn't ask what any of the papers meant. She just sat down cross-legged across from me and said, "You've been carrying something for weeks. You don't have to tell me what it is. But I've watched you shrink every single day since February, and I don't think you get to shrink for the rest of your life just because it's easier tonight. I told her some of it. Not everything, but enough. She listened without flinching at any of it, which, in that house, had never once happened to me. You've spent your whole life being quiet so nobody could use it against you, she said. This is the first time being quiet actually is the plan. That's not the same as giving up. Don't let one bad night convince you it is. I didn't call Arthur to drop anything the next morning. I called him to ask what came next. About 10 days in. An investigator working with Arthur's office. A soft-spoken woman named Deborah Okafor who specialized in trust fraud, called with something that didn't fit. Wade Ferris has done this before, she said. Not with your family. 4 years ago, a different trust, different state, a family named Whitfield outside Springfield, Missouri. Same pattern. Shell LLC, a notary he knew personally, assets moved into real estate that was harder to trace. That case never went to trial. The family settled quietly out of court, and Wade walked away with a slap on the wrist from his bank's internal compliance office. Not even a public record. That was the moment this stopped being a story about one greedy stepmother. It became a story about a man who had built a quiet, repeatable business out of exactly this kind of theft, and had simply found in Renee, his second willing partner. I didn't yet know he'd try to become a problem for me personally, not just a name on a document. That came 2 weeks later, and it came to my front door. Wade showed up at my off-campus apartment. Not the house. My apartment, a place Renee shouldn't have had the address for, which meant she'd given it to him. He introduced himself as a family friend, checking in, smiling in a way that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. He asked, almost gently, whether I'd really thought through what an audit like this could do to Colton's reputation, to Renee's health, to my own future in the industry my father had built. Financial fraud allegations get messy for everyone attached to the family name, Nora. Even the innocent ones. People remember headlines longer than they remember footnotes. It wasn't a threat, not technically. It was worse than a threat, because it was calm, unreasonable sounding, and aimed directly at the one thing that house had always used against me, the fear that speaking up would cost me more than staying quiet did. I didn't answer him. I closed the door, called Arthur from my bedroom with my back against the wall, and told him what had just happened. That's witness intimidation. Potentially, Arthur said, his voice sharper than I'd heard it. Document it, exact words if you can, time, what he was wearing, whether anyone else saw him arrive. This helps us. It doesn't hurt us. Men like Wade only visit in person when the paperwork is starting to scare them. I didn't hear from Wade directly again after that. But 3 days later my landlord mentioned, offhand, that a man had come by the leasing office asking informal questions about whether I was current on rent, whether I'd had any complaints filed against me, small, deniable things designed to build a file on me rather than to threaten me outright. Arthur said that was standard for men like Wade. Build enough small doubt, and you don't need a real threat at all. Just enough smoke that a judge might wonder if there's fire somewhere. That single visit to my apartment, meant to make me smaller, ended up becoming one of the strongest pieces of evidence in the entire case. But it also meant that for the rest of that summer, I checked the peephole every single time before I opened my own front door, and that's a habit I still haven't fully lost, even now. It was during that same stretch, almost by accident, that Arthur called me on a Thursday afternoon and said 4 words that stopped me cold in the middle of the campus quad. The conditions were met. I didn't understand at first. Then I remembered the storage unit. Your father's instructions were specific, Arthur said. The unit was to remain sealed unless a forensic audit was opened against an acting trustee during the vesting period. That happened 3 weeks ago, Nora. I should have told you sooner. But I wanted the audit team to have first access. In case anything inside was itself evidence, we drove out to Broken Arrow together the following Saturday. The unit was small, climate-controlled, rented under the name of a shell entity my father had apparently set up years before he ever got sick. Something even Arthur admitted he hadn't fully understood the purpose of until that day. Inside were file boxes, older bank records going back over a decade, and a single sealed envelope with my name on it in my father's handwriting. I want to tell you what was in that envelope, and I promise I will, but I need you to understand something first. Because it changes how you'll read everything that came after it. My father hadn't just protected the trust with a legal clause and a deadline. He had, years before Renee ever showed the first sign of what she'd eventually do, already suspected exactly this kind of person might one day sit across from his daughter at that dining table. And what he'd left in that envelope wasn't just a warning. It was proof, gathered quietly, patiently, of something Renee had done years earlier, in a different city, under a different name, long before she ever married my father at all. That detail alone turned the entire case in a direction none of us, not even Arthur, had been prepared for. The letter was short. In it, my father wrote that he'd hired a private investigator 2 years into his marriage to Renee. After noticing small inconsistencies in her account of her first husband's death, inconsistencies that had never quite settled right with him, he never confronted her with what he found. He told me, in that letter, that he'd made a choice to stay. To keep an eye on things quietly, to build protections rather than accusations. Because he didn't have proof strong enough to act on, and because, in his words, "Your mother would never forgive me for tearing a family apart on a suspicion. Even a strong one." But he'd kept the file. He'd kept everything. And he left it exactly where it would only ever be found if someone, someday, needed it badly enough to go looking. Arthur read the accompanying documents twice before he said anything. Then he looked at me and said, "Quiet, careful, Nora. I think your father just handed us Wade Ferris's real beginning. Not just his most recent one. Renee's first husband," the file suggested, hadn't died the way the official record said he had. And the numbers around his estate followed a pattern uncomfortably close to the one now unfolding around mine. I'm not going to tell you everything that came out of that envelope right now, because some of it is still moving through a separate, ongoing legal process in another state, and I don't want to get ahead of what's actually been proven in a courtroom. But I will tell you this changed the entire tone of the case from that point forward. It stopped being only about a trust and 11 properties in Tulsa. It became about a pattern that may have started long before I was even born. One my father had quietly been the only person watching for over a decade. The last stretch of the audit moved faster after that. Deborah's team cross-referenced the older file against the newer bank records Arthur already had. And within 3 weeks, they had enough to bring everything to a head at once. Rather than waiting the full 8 weeks originally projected, the story took its sharpest turn not in a bank record or a doorway, but in a courtroom 3 days before my birthday. In an emergency hearing Renee's new attorney had filed to try to delay the trust transfer entirely. Renee's lawyer, a tall man with an expensive tan named Preston Cade, stood up first. He argued that Nora Bennett, quote, had exhibited a documented pattern of emotional instability since her father's death, and that transferring an 11 property, multi-million-dollar trust to someone potentially susceptible to outside manipulation without further psychological evaluation would constitute reckless risk to the state's beneficiaries. Meaning, in practice, Colton, whose college fund, Cade argued, depended in part on continued family stewardship of these assets. I sat next to Arthur, hands flat on my knees, watching the judge's face for any sign of which way this would go. For about 4 full minutes, it looked like it might actually go Renee's way. The judge, an older woman named Judge Holloway, asked pointed questions about my academic standing, my mental health history, whether I had ever sought counseling. Arthur answered each one calmly, factually, and I could feel, in my chest, exactly how thin the margin was between a life I controlled and one Renee got to keep controlling a little longer. There was one moment, right before Arthur stood to respond, when the key witness we needed almost didn't make it into the room at all. Ellen Marsh, the notary whose cooperation everything hinged on, had called Deborah's office that same morning, panicked, saying her own attorney had advised her overnight not to testify without broader immunity guarantees than the DA's office had offered. For almost 90 minutes that morning, before the hearing even began, it looked like the single strongest piece of evidence we had might never make it in front of Judge Holloway at all. Deborah spent that time on the phone in the courthouse hallway, working with the DA to extend just enough additional protection to bring Ellen back on board, while Arthur and I sat outside the courtroom not knowing whether we'd be walking in with a case or without one. Ellen arrived 11 minutes before the hearing started. I remember exactly what she looked like walking in. Gray coat, hands shaking slightly around her own folder, And I remember thinking that the entire next several years of my life were about to be decided by whether one frightened woman found the nerve to sit down in that room. Then Arthur stood, and instead of arguing about my mental state at all, he simply said, "Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence a notarized statement obtained yesterday from Ellen Marsh, the notary public who signed the disputed Route 9 transfer documents." The room went very quiet. Ellen Marsh, it turned out, had been contacted by Deborah's investigation team days earlier and, facing her own potential disbarment and criminal exposure for notarizing documents she knew to be backdated, had agreed to cooperate in exchange for leniency. Her statement confirmed, in her own words, that Renee Bennett had asked her, in October of the prior year, to notarize a signature on a document dated to appear as though it predated Daniel Bennett's death, when in fact it had been signed nearly 4 years after his funeral. Judge Holloway read the statement twice, slowly, at the bench. Then she looked at Preston Cade and said, "Counsel, does your client still wish to proceed with the competency argument, given what I just read?" Cade asked for a 10-minute recess. He came back and withdrew the motion entirely. The trust was formally frozen by court order that same afternoon, 2 days ahead of my birthday instead of just 11. Since the notarized confession moved everything faster than even Arthur had expected, Renee was removed as trustee on the spot, pending the criminal referral already underway. Wade Ferris was named in a parallel investigation tied to both my father's estate and, thanks to Deborah's earlier discovery, the older Whitfield case out of Missouri, which had technically never been closed, only quietly settled. And, quietly, in a separate filing that wouldn't become public for several more months. The material from the storage unit was referred to investigators in the state where Renee's first husband had died, reopening a question that had gone unasked for almost 2 decades. And there was one more thing. The thing Arthur said made his stomach turn the most, uncovered in the same records pull that caught Ellen Marsh's confession. Renee had opened a custodial account years earlier, when I was still a minor, technically in my name, meant to hold small dividend distributions from the trust for incidental expenses. She had been quietly siphoning distributions out of that account since I was 17, small enough each time not to raise flags, using it, we later learned, to help cover Colton's tuition at a private university my father's estate had never been intended to fund. That detail hurt in a way the property theft hadn't. It wasn't just greed. It was that even the smaller, in my own name account, the one thing that should have been safely mine, had been quietly hollowed out for someone else's benefit the entire time. Renee did not know the full case had closed in on her until a process server showed up at the house on a Tuesday afternoon, less than 48 hours after the hearing. I know because Colton texted me 40 minutes later. "What did you do?" I didn't answer right away. I still wasn't sure, even then, whose side he was really on. In week 3 of the audit, he'd called me late one night, voice tight in a way I hadn't heard since we were kids, and told me Renee was talking about the competency claim before it was ever filed, and that he'd found forwarded invoices in her email from an LLC he didn't recognize. I didn't know, hearing it, whether he was genuinely trying to help me or whether Renee had sent him to feed me a controlled version of events, to see how I'd react. Arthur had told me to treat anything from Colton as unverified until it corroborated something we already had independently. In the end, we never needed his information directly. The bank records and Ellen Marsh's statement did the work on their own. But it meant, for months afterward, I genuinely didn't know if my stepbrother had tried to help me or had simply been another tool in his mother's hands, and honestly, that uncertainty sat with me longer than almost anything else in this story. The last piece of this happened on my actual birthday, a Saturday. Renee had, unbelievably, still planned a small family dinner, I think because part of her still believed I might sign whatever remained once legal control passed to me. She'd invited a notary, unaware Ellen Marsh was already cooperating with prosecutors. Wade wasn't there. He'd been advised by his own attorney to stay away from anyone connected to either estate. Arthur Voss came with me. Renee's face, when she saw him step through her own front door, told me everything about how much she'd hoped this exact moment would never come. I didn't yell. I didn't throw anything. I sat down at the table my father used to eat breakfast at every morning of my childhood and said, "I know about Route 9. I know about the LLC. I know about Wade and about Missouri. I know about the custodial account. I know about your first husband, Renee. The court knows all of it too. And so does the DA. Renee's smile held for almost 5 full seconds before it finally cracked. And something in her face shifted at the mention of her first husband that I hadn't expected, something closer to fear than anger. You have no idea what you're doing to this family, she said quietly. I know exactly what I'm doing, I said. I'm doing what my father already set up for me to do 6 years before he even knew he'd need to. I just had to notice, and I finally did. Colton stayed at the table, staring at his plate, saying nothing. Which was, for him, its own kind of confession. And its own kind of answer to the question I'd never fully asked him out loud. Renee is currently facing civil litigation from the trust and a pending criminal case for forgery and breach of fiduciary duty. Her attorney has indicated they may pursue a plea agreement given Ellen Marsh's cooperation. 2 of the 3 diverted properties were recovered through the court's clawback order. Route 9 was gone for good, sold to a buyer with no idea it was ever anything but a clean transaction. And there was nothing the courts could unwind on that one. I still drive past it sometimes. My father used to take me there on Saturdays when I was small, buy me a soda from the lobby machine while he checked on tenants. I hope whoever owns it now takes care of it the way he did. Wade Ferris was indicted separately, tied to both my father's estate and the older Whitfield case in Missouri, which prosecutors they reopened once Deborah's findings reached them. Deborah called me herself the week the Missouri charges were formally filed, mostly, I think, because she wanted me to hear it from her before I saw it in a news alert. You should know, she said. The Whitfield daughter's case never even made it to a hearing. Her family settled fast, quietly, out of fear more than strategy, and Wade walked with almost nothing on his record. If your case hadn't surfaced when it did, there's a real chance he'd have gone on doing this to a 3rd family and a 4th for years. Did she know? The daughter, I mean. Did she know he did it again? She does now, Deborah said. I called her myself, the same way I'm calling you. She asked me to tell you thank you if I ever got the chance. I never met the Whitfield family. But I think about that woman sometimes, a stranger 3 states away who went through some version of exactly what I did. Years before me, alone, without anyone catching it in time to help her the way I got help. I hope, wherever she is, that call from Deborah felt like even a small piece of a door finally opening. Colton and I still talk, occasionally, carefully. 6 months after that birthday, he asked if we could meet, just the 2 of us, at a diner off the highway between his new apartment and mine. Neutral ground neither of us had ever eaten at with Renee. He looked older than I remembered, tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. He turned his coffee mug in slow circles for almost a full minute before he said anything. The invoices I sent you were real, he finally said. I wasn't lying about that. I was telling the truth that whole week, and I was terrified the whole time that telling you the truth would somehow still end up being the wrong move, because it always was with her. I didn't know how to just be honest without it costing me something. I still don't, most days. Why didn't you say any of this until now? I asked, because by the time the case closed, I didn't know if you'd believe me, and I didn't know if I deserved you to. He looked up. I'm not asking you to forgive her. I'm not even really asking you to forgive me. I just didn't want you walking around for the rest of your life thinking I was on her side the whole time, when for at least that 1 week, I really wasn't. I believe him now, mostly. Some doors that house shut don't reopen all the way, no matter how much time passes, but that diner conversation reopened one of them. Just enough. I run the firm now. 8 properties instead of 11, but every deed has my name on it in ink nobody forged. And every distribution goes exactly where my father intended, down to the smallest custodial account, which I closed the day I got full control and replaced with one no one but me can touch. A year passed before I let myself feel like the ground under. All of it was actually solid. Renee eventually took the plea agreement. Preston Kate had quietly pushed her toward once Ellen Marsh's cooperation made a trial almost impossible to win. She pleaded guilty to reduced charges, avoided prison, and was ordered to pay restitution to the trust over a 10-year schedule. along with a permanent injunction barring her from ever serving as a fiduciary or trustee again in the state of Oklahoma. I didn't attend the sentencing. Arthur went and called me after and said only, "It's done, Nora, all of it. You can stop watching the door now." Wade Ferris's case took longer, tangled up with the reopened Whitfield matter in Missouri, but Deborah kept me loosely updated. He lost his position on the bank's board within a month of the indictment. Last I heard, both cases were still working their way through separate courts, and I understood, finally, why Arthur had looked so unsettled the day he first mentioned Wade's name. Some people don't just make one mistake. They build a whole quiet second life out of making the same one, over and over. Two people who trusted the wrong friend from the bank. As for the older matter from the storage unit, the question of what really happened to Renee's first husband all those years ago, that investigation is still open in another state as of the last update I received. I've been told not to discuss the specifics publicly while it's active, and I intend to respect that for now. But I'll say this much. My father spent the last years of his life quietly building a second, hidden layer of protection around a suspicion he never had the proof to act on while he was alive. And it's entirely possible that the envelope he sealed in that storage unit ends up mattering to someone I've never met, in a case that has nothing to do with me at all. Priya came to my apartment the week the plea deal was finalized with a bottle of cheap champagne and two mismatched mugs. Because neither of us owned actual champagne glasses. "To not shrinking," she said, and we drank cheap champagne out of an Oklahoma State mug and a chipped one that said "World's Okayest Roommate." And I laughed harder that night than I had in years. I think about Arthur Voss's sentence a lot. The one about the clock ticking on both sides. My father spent 6 quiet years preparing a door for me he never got to see me walk through, and one more, secret, door behind that one that he hoped I'd never actually need. Renee spent 4.5 loud, careful years trying to find a way to lock the first door before I could, never once knowing there was a second one behind her the whole time. And Wade spent longer than that building an entire quiet second career out of doing it to other families too. In the end, it wasn't volume that decided which of us was right. It was who had actually been paying attention the whole time, and who was willing to keep paying attention even when it would have been so much easier to stop.
Thanks for watching. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.